rang out in the foggy dew. Right proudly high in Dublin town hung there the flag of war. For 'twas better to die 'neath an Irish sky than at Suvla or Sudelbar. And from the plains of royal Meath, strong men came hurrying through, while Britannia's Huns with their long-range guns sailed in through the foggy dew. Our bravest fell, and the Requiem bell rang mournfully and clear. For those who died at Eastertide in the springing of the year, how the world did gaze with deep amaze at those fearless men, but few, who bore the fight that freedom's light might shine through the foggy dew. And back through the glen I rode again, and my heart with grief was sore. For I parted then with valiant men, whom I never shall see more. But to and fro in my dreams I go, and I kneel and pray for you. For slavery fled, all glorious dead, when you fell in the foggy dew.
Was that gorgeous or what? That's
One moment, please, folks. We're going to begin in just a second. Good afternoon to our friends in Ireland, and good morning to our friends from around the United States. Currently, we have friends from at least 29 different states joining us. Welcome, everyone, to today's virtual event, Legacy Justice Appeal, brought to you through the cooperation of the Ancient Order Hibernians in America and Relatives for Justice, Belfast. Thank you, Martin Galvin. AOH Freedom for Ireland Chairman, and Mark Thompson, Relative for Justice Director. We welcome our tremendous speakers and guests. Our speakers include Mark Thompson, Relatives for Justice, Jerry Kelly, Sinn Féin Policing and Justice spokesman, as well as a former Long Cash escapee. We welcome victim family members, Pauline Quinn, whose brother John Quinn was murdered on March 3rd, 1991, in Kappa, County Tyrone, along with Malcolm Nugent, Dwayne O'Donnell, and Thomas Armstrong. We also welcome Jim Clinton, whose wife Teresa was murdered in their home in Belfast, 1991. Our special guests include Bruce Morrison, former U.S. Congressman who was deeply involved with the peace process, Billy Lawless, former Irish Senator for the diaspora, Karen Keane, LAOH National President, Dolores Desch, LAOH Freedom for Ireland Chair. Additionally, we have representatives from many Irish organizations from around the United States we'll hear from during the question and answering period. We now invite Martin Galvin to begin Legacy Justice Appeal. Martin?
Carger, today, Irish America, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and the other Irish organizations are going to participate or be a part of a Legacy Justice Appeal. What happened is that last Thursday, through Relatives for Justice, more than 3,500 family members who had seen members of their own family murdered, some by British Crown forces. I look down the list, I see Brenda Downs, the case that I witnessed, or some had their family members murdered by British forces, just British agents working with the British troops and to commit murder and get away with it. These families never got truth or justice. They fought for it through groups like Relatives for Justice. They got court cases in which the European Parliament and the European Court of Justice said that they were entitled to full, fair investigations in which family members could be involved under Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights. They had negotiations in which the Irish government was involved with the British government, other political parties. We're going to hear about some of those years of negotiations, which finally, in December of 2014, led to the Stormont House Agreement, the prospect of a historical investigations unit, along with other legacy mechanisms, which offered these families just a prospect of truth. That was reaffirmed a year ago in January by the British government as part of the New Decade, New Approach appeal. And then last March, British Secretary for the North of Ireland, Boris Johnson's British Secretary, Brandon Lewis, said that they had a different idea, that instead of the Stormont House Agreement, instead of offering these families a prospect, a path to truth, that they might do something else, which these families are very concerned, which simply mean the British government going through these cases on a computer, said there's nothing here further to investigate, closing them down, and ultimately denying these families a path to truth. As I said, this is something I feel deeply about. Many of us, if you look through the list, you'll know families who are involved, like Liam Ryan's family, like some of the other families involved. This is something that's very important to us, and we're grateful to Mark Thompson and Relatives for Justice for putting this together, for inviting Irish America to be a part of it. So without further ado, a person who's been working on this initiative for a long period of time, who's put it together, who's put this on the agenda across the north of Ireland, and now hoping to do it across the United States and in the south of Ireland and the Irish Parliament, the Dáil. Mark Thompson, the chairman of Relatives for Justice.
Thank you, Martin. First of all, I want to thank everybody for giving us the opportunity once again, and for families to kind of speak about their experiences and to reach out to North America, and especially to the Irish diaspora that have been so supportive of Relatives for Justice and all our endeavours in terms of holding the British state to account for its actions. I suppose Thursday morning was a big morning for 3,500 relatives and many more. I must say, we've had hundreds of relatives contact us that we weren't able to reach for this initiative, or who came to us too late. So the actual figure now is in and around 4,000 names. Obviously 3,500 were printed in the papers. And those families went, some of them 3 generations, on Thursday morning to pick up that paper. And what's very encouraging in the call in the open letter to both the Taoiseach and the British Prime Minister is that many of those who put their names to it are 35 years and under. They're second and third generations, having grandparents killed, maybe parents killed, siblings killed, and aunts and uncles. And in some senses, they live in homes with the living legacy of this, looking at pictures of people when they weren't even born who were killed, but yet the traumatic and transgenerational kind of impact that has had is that they know that person intimately from memory, and they know the injustice that was perpetrated as well as the actual taking of life. And they're saying the past is ever present, and they're determined. In fact, many of them are engaged legally and in the courts challenging these issues. And it won't go away. The past is ever present and it won't be wished away. But I want to, because some Americans have asked, what is the kind of context? And the context of this is that we had 3 decades of conflict. And 3 decades of conflict, British state forces killed directly while wearing uniform and on duty 367 Irish citizens. And the majority of those were unarmed and uninvolved civilians. And of those combatants that they engaged in premeditated, pre-planned assassination and ambush attacks, they were politically sanctioned, and they led to numerous losses of life. And the British government did that when they had ample opportunity to make safe and effective arrests within the rule of law, but chose to kill people instead. Indeed, we're dealing with a case more recently and supporting a family that's waiting on an inquest, young Francis Bradley from South Derry, who was not only shot by the SAS, he was arrested by them, interrogated and beaten and then executed. And the pathology report it makes that very clear. And his family are waiting on an inquest that's being delayed. And I suppose the whole issue of legacy and dealing with the past and dealing with what the state done and the collusion that they've been involved in, when I say 367 people killed, and remember, around 80 of those were children by the UN definition of 18 and downwards. There's been no accountability. There's been a de facto policy of impunity. Indeed, only 4 British soldiers ever served time in jail, collectively in and around 12 years, whilst 25,000 Republicans went through the prisons and the process of dip-lock courts and were incarcerated for maybe around 125,000 years, it's calculated. So it gives you the disparity of injustice. And I suppose if you look at some of the big instances, the 3 largest bombs that happened in this island were McGurk's Bar in the North Belfast area, the Dublin Monaghan bombings, and even the Omagh bomb in more recent times. And all of those incidents involve agents of the British or the hand directly of the British. And it gives you a sense of when you calculate collusion. And in 1995, we published a report that documented from the importation of weapons from South Africa by British military intelligence to rearm their allies and loyalist paramilitary death squads to attack nationalists and Republicans. We documented 229 instances where those weapons provided by the British were used to kill Irish citizens. And there's been no accountability virtually for any of that, no truth for it. So in the context of an evolving peace process, the dealing with the past wasn't tackled in some senses. And what the peace process did for many families, it created a safe space for the first time where they could raise their heads above the parapet and begin to challenge the injustices that they had experienced. Because it's probably important to point out that during the conflict, when people had their loved ones killed by soldiers in the RUC or in loyalist attacks where there's clear evidence of collusion, there was a fear, a palpable fear, where they didn't want to kind of stand up and be counted because they were afraid for their other children. They were afraid of being attacked. And so the peace process created a safer space to examine these issues and call for accountability. And what has happened is that there's this narrative that the British have propagated that somehow or other their forces came and they were peacekeepers, that they were keeping 2 warring factions apart, and that somehow they may have made some mistakes which are regrettable, but by and large, that's the narrative of the conflict from their perspective. Of course, that's totally untrue. They were engaged in organizations and arming them, directing them, pseudo-gangs, using them for political purposes, switching them off when the political temperature called for it, switching them up and driving them to kill people when it was required. And I often think about this issue of British claim of neutrality. In the 1990s, when we documented the report about collusion, and loyalists were killing more people than Republicans, and yet not once did they deploy covert units or the SAS to prevent their attacks. And not that we would advocate for that, because the SAS were a killing machine, but they didn't do that. And when we found out where the SAS were present, they were actually assisting the killers. So in the killing of Sam Marshall in Lurgan, as he left an RUC barrack after signing bail, we found out when the loyalists attack him and chase him and kill him, that there are at least 9 undercover covert soldiers belonging to either the Force Research Unit and or the SAS who observed the killing. When you look at the killing of Roseanne Mallon in Tyrone, an attack on a Republican family who were told that we will kill a member of your family by the authorities. And that attack is realized and happens and she is killed in May 94. And then we find cameras, and the cameras are there relaying footage the covert soldiers of the SAS dug in, observing the killing as it take place. Much in the way it did on the attack on Bernadette McAliskey's home in Tyrone, where her and her husband Michael were shot, and the parachute regiment said we were only told to arrest the people on the way out after they went in to do the shooting. So in some senses, what we're trying to do is account for the past and correct the historical narrative and to give recovery and healing to families, but also, you know, to tell the truth about what happened and have it accounted for properly. And so there was many initiatives. We had, you know, Eames Bradley came together for an initiative which the British wouldn't implement. Then we had Haas O'Sullivan from the US trying to assist the process. Then finally, with the both governments in the room with all the parties in 2014, and in December 2014, that culminated in an agreement between all the parties, which was a human rights way forward. Because what families were doing in the meantime, they were using international law and they were using the domestic law with the international focus on it to change the domestic law, because it's important to understand how impunity was administered in this jurisdiction. You know, the RUC investigated themselves, they investigated the SAS, there was no accountability for those investigations, and they provided impunity through those with no prosecutions. And so what we tried to do was to bring cases to the international court to put pressure to change that, which we were successful. So what we're now saying is that after the agreement that was negotiated, and Jerry will talk, I'm sure, a little bit more detail about that, we wanted it implemented because it was going to satisfy in a human rights way the needs of families for effective and proper investigation and accountability for all the deaths and killings. Now, there's huge resistance from the British government because they don't want their role in the conflict to be altered in any way. And what they're doing is trying to preserve that narrative that we were neutral peacekeepers, which is completely untrue. Even one glimpse and one examination of the De Silva review that falls far short in the Finucane demand by the Finucane family for a judicial public inquiry will show the extent of collusion. There's a figure in it that says that 85% of all the intelligence in the hands of loyalist paramilitaries came from the British Army, the RUC, and the intelligence services, the British intelligence services, for the purposes of targeting and killing citizens. So, you know, the extent of British involvement, they're trying to keep a lid on it, and families are trying to praise that lid. In more recent times, we've had a police ombudsman that has a retrospective power as part of the peace agreement to look at historic killings involving RUC collusion. There's 460 odd cases on their books. The plug has been pulled in terms of resources and funding to hamper the office. The office has been under attack. Many people will know about the Locken Island atrocity in June 1994. Where 6 men were killed watching the soccer match that was being played in the Giants Stadium in New York between Ireland and Italy, which was attended by the then Taoiseach and various dignitaries around the peace process. And that attack took place, and those 6 men were killed and many more were injured. And so the film was made about that, and then the Ombudsman's report came that found collusion. The very people that were the subject of the investigation of the Ombudsman's report, the retired special branch officers of the RUC, took the Ombudsman to court to block, tackle, and prevent them from going forward. And so we were having that. At the same time, going to the international community and putting the pressure on the criminal justice system and the judiciary, the Lord Chief Justice accepted there had to be proper independent inquests that adhered to international law, whereby the full facts would be, for the first time, come to light. And then we saw Arlene Foster use a political veto to block the funding going to the Lord Chief Justice to hold inquests. So at every nook and turn, as families fight and use human rights and use law and use international law and try to resolve these issues, the British interfere. Indeed, Mark McGuinness said in his resignation speech, roughly 4 minutes into it, one of the reasons why they were collapsing the institutions among all the bad faith by the British and Unionists and all of that was the very fact that there was even collusion between Arlene Foster and the Unionist Party with the NIO and the Conservative government to use that veto to stop legacy inquests from taking place. Ultimately, families brought her to court, and the court found that she had acted unlawfully in blocking and using that political veto to stop families having inquests. So what we're experiencing is when we apply the yardstick of human rights and fairness and a level playing field, the British changed the rules and moved the goalposts. And that's why 3,500 relatives signed that petition. They have the Stormont House Agreement finally implemented, and to say that it's also an international agreement, it's an international agreement that stems from the Good Friday Agreement because it's between 2 sovereign governments and 5 political parties to the Northern Executive. So it involves the triangle of 3 executives in terms of looking at this issue. And it has to be implemented, and the rights of families have to be upheld. This isn't in the benevolence or the goodwill of the British or Irish or any government. These are rights and entitlements, and this goes to the heart of the peace process around peace requires justice and equality and the provision of those, and we need to see those. Families have waited long enough, and relatives have died, but new generations are coming on, and we're heartened by what happened. Families are heartened by what has happened in signing this letter, and it has captured a mood to drive the implement this. Now, what the British government are trying to do is indemnify and provide an amnesty for its British soldiers, its RUC, and those agents within paramilitary groups it ran and controlled that were involved in killings. And that's unacceptable. We have to challenge that. And that's why we're reaching out to Irish America. That's why we put it in the Echo. That's why we're partnering with the AOH. And we're trying to revisit what we did in the past when we had difficulties with congressional sign-on letters, congressional hearings. And we can't do this on our own. We need the support of Irish America and the political support to bring over the line the British and get this resolved once and for all for families. So that's kind of in a nutshell. But I'm really conscious that Pauline and Jim are going to speak, and their experiences are more important, and they signify that these experiences resonate with so many families that will be watching this. So it's so important to listen to their stories, because this is what this is about. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Our next speaker. What we decided to do, there are 3,500 people who signed this letter, who are making this appeal, 3,500 victims' relatives. In order to understand this, in order to see how important it is, I think the best way, we decided and found that the best way to do it is to just call on 1 or 2 of those victims' relatives, so you can hear from them how important it is, and then magnify it, multiply it by 3,500 stories, which are all much the same, have all gone through the same heartbreak, the same fight for justice. So the first person that we're going to call on to do that, from Tyrone, someone who was a Republican who was imprisoned at the time of her brother was killed along with 3 others in Kappa County, Tyrone, somebody who's gone through this heartbreak and actually works now for Relatives for Justice, so that she could not only work for justice for her own family, but to help others seeking the same justice through Relatives for Justice, and that is Pauline Quinn. Pauline.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin and Mark and the AOH for inviting me here today. It was an honour to be asked to represent the families, and I suppose I was a bit nervous about it. My initial thing was, no, I'm not doing it, but we do need to speak out, and we need to tell our story. So big Céad Míle Fáilte to everybody, and thank you for taking the time today as well to be here, giving up your time, and a special Céad Míle Fáilte to any of the families that will be listening in. So just let me begin by saying that our story did not start on the 3rd of March 1991 when our John was murdered. I've no need to tell you of the history of our country, but just to put it into the time scale and a background. John Martin Quinn was born on the 13th of June 1968, 47 years after our country had been partitioned. He was born into an apartheid state where discrimination was the order of the day. He was 3 when internment began, and he saw many terrible events in his young life. Our people have endured much, from internment, imprisonment, hunger strikes, supergrasses, plastic bullets, the SAS shoot to kill, collusion, British agents, harassment, beatings, a dirty war here. Our story is one out of 3,600 people who have lost their lives. Our John, as he's affectionately known and still talked about, wasn't just a statistic. He had a name, he had a life. He was a son, a brother, a friend, an uncle, a comrade. He was off this land. He had a full-time job, and as we lived on a small farm out in the country, he helped out when he could. John was 12 whenever Martin Hurston died in hunger strike, a young man from our local area. Martin was 24 years old. John knew a lot of the lads as well who were killed at Glagall. He witnessed first-hand brutality and harassment, getting many beatings at the side of the road. And one night, the beating was so severe that it caused him to lose his hair, which made him instantly recognisable to the crime forces. I'm just going to show you a photo of John whenever he was very young. This is John, he was very young. And then this is him after he had got the beating, so he's in the middle. And then this is Malcolm, who was killed along with him. And this is their good friend, Peter, as well. So if everybody can see that, maybe it's a bit of a shine of it. So as opposed to the bald head made him very recognisable, he stood out. But his love for life, he loved life, and he had an impish sense of humour. He was always up to some crack or some carry on. But that all came to an end just after 10:30 on Sunday, the 3rd of March, 1991. John, along with his friends Malcolm, 20, Dwayne, who was 17, and their friend Malky, drove up to the local pub, Boyle's Bar, which is our local haunt. We played pool there and we all socialised there, we all gathered there. But before John had the chance to turn the car engine off, there were hails of bullets being pumped into this car at close range. One gunman firing through the front window of the car and the second gunman firing through the rear window. John's car was riddled with bullets. When we eventually got John's clothes back, they were completely shredded with the amount of bullets that were pumped into him. The one that killed him, well, they all of those bullets done damage, but he was also shot through the head. One of the weapons used to murder our sons and brothers was also used to murder 17 other people. This weapon, along with an arsenal of guns and ammunition, were imported into the north of Ireland by loyalists in conjunction with state agents and British intelligence groups. On the day that John, Malcolm, Dwayne and Tommy were killed, it had been noted there was a lot of security forces in the area. And if I could just give you a quick background of the area that we were born and reared in. So if you can imagine, so I'm speaking to people now in America and Canada and Australia, and I know that there's people in Ireland as well that have joined in here. So imagine this small rural village, this little village out in the country, surrounded by fields, rocky outcrops. It's mountainous, it's farmland, mountainous farmland. We're high up in the hills. And when no one else gets snow, we get it. We actually have snow here today. We're a proud people from Outmore, Kappa and Gelby and surrounding areas. We have a strong sense of community. And we live in a place that's steeped in a history of rebellion. The brave Renardine, Shane Bernard Donnelly being one. And just as a point of interest for anybody that might not know this, Altmore was also the birthplace of James Shields, who became a politician in North America, rumoured for challenging Abraham Lincoln to a duel. So it's just a wee bit of history for you. But anyway, this is a quiet rural area, hard to get in and out of without being noticed. But the day on the 3rd of March 1991, there were checkpoints set up, heavy helicopter activity all day, and then before the attack, they all disappeared. So to backtrack to a week before our people were murdered and to the end of February 1991, remembering that John, Malcolm, Dwayne and Tommy were killed on the 3rd of March. So 1 week before that, a regiment of the British Army accompanied by an RUC man came into Boyle's Bar. They drew a detailed plan of the inside of the premises, and they also took notes of who was in the bar at that time. 1 week later, 4 men lay dead. Dwayne, 17 years old, Malcolm, 20, John 22 and Thomas. Thomas had been shot through the broken toilet window of the bar. Thomas was 52. He had went in there into the toilets in the bar to go to safety when he heard the shooting. So the terrorist who shot through the broken toilet window seemed to have prior knowledge that by shooting in there, he would clearly be able to target more people. So we have long held the knowledge and the belief that there was collusion between the RUC, British Army, intelligence services, and the loyalist paramilitary organisations. And we believe that the now PSNI are off the scene. We believe that those orders to kill our people came from the top. And when people talk about there being one bad apple, we believe the whole orchard was rotten. Those death squads could roam freely without fear of hindrance or prosecution. Our local village and outlying areas experienced some of the highest levels of security force surveillance in the north of Ireland. And can I just say that at this point, due to time restrictions, that I have briefly covered John, Malcolm, Dwayne and Tommy's murders, and I'm very mindful of their families who may be watching. And I don't want to do them or their loved ones an injustice. Also, it's painful to remember and to speak it out. But I would say that if anybody does want to know a wee bit more, I have no hesitation if anybody wants to email me or whatever, I get my details of Martin Galvin. But there's also has been a book written. There's a wee bit today, like show and tell. So this book was written in conjunction with the families, and it's counterinsurgency and collusion in the north of Ireland. So if anybody did want to know more, that book's available. We're just an ordinary people. Those who were brutally taken from us, from the hearts of our families, were ordinary people. They were joiners, plasters, builders, teachers, students, councillors, people of political aspirations, people of no political aspirations. War and the effects of it do not disappear overnight. They leave long-lasting trauma, pain and grief in societies in which they occur. It is a commonly held misperception throughout the world that conflict in Ireland is over and done with because of the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. What is not recognised widely, however, is the extent of the conflict on our people. The emotional, psychological, and in many cases, the physical effect we've been left with. Many of us have lost loved ones. Many of us have been attacked. Many of us were brutalised. The context of the conflict means that many people did not get the full closure they required. They did not discover why or how their loved ones had been targeted. And even though relative peace is welcome, it comes without the conflict being fully investigated, without a sense of truth or conciliation to what happened here. One of the biggest challenges facing us now as a society is dealing with the legacy, of which 3,600 people lost their lives and human rights abuses were systematically perpetrated. The past cannot be undone, but it is my belief that we can be dealt with in a way that acknowledges the loss, the harm and the abuses inflicted. The north of Ireland was a battleground. The British government clearly perpetrated acts of war crimes, and they're still denying our rights under domestic and international law. Mentions of vexatious prosecutions and witch hunts are merely smokescreens. Again, to evade and avoid and to continue with their policy of bad faith and dishonesty. With the help of relatives of justice who are with us every step of the way and who keep the families at the heart of this process, our message is simple. We demand truth, accountability and justice. On the 25th anniversary of John, Malcolm, Dwayne and Tommy's murder, RFJ launched a report which can be viewed online on Relatives for Justice website, along with other reports that have been completed by other families seeking justice. Heartbreaking stories of love and loss. And this is one of the reports. This is one that belongs to us. Speaking personally, I don't have an issue with those who pulled the trigger in the murder of John, but I do with the government that was complicit in that murder. They are responsible for those actions, those who researched it, funded and drove this policy of collusion. The British government must accept responsibility for the murder of its own citizens, and not cover up the truth. All we are asking for is the truth. And I feel that we've been let down as well by the Irish government. And a quote that comes to mind is that of Martin Luther King: "There comes a time when silence is betrayal." We're still fighting, and we want to thank you, Irish America, for your continued support. And with your help, we can put pressure on the British government. What would you do if it was your brother, your son, your father, your mother or daughter, sister, husband or wife who'd been so brutally taken away from you? John will be dead 30 years on the 3rd of March this year. His father, Pat Quinn, just turned 90 years young. John's mother died 2 years ago with Parkinson's, which I believe a contributing factor was the terrible stresses piled upon her over the years. And John's brother, Gerard, died 1 year ago. They didn't get to hear any truth, but to honour John and his friends, it is our duty to remain defiant in our pursuit for truth, accountability and justice. Our conscience wouldn't allow us anymore to do otherwise, and I think about John all the time. I try to remember him in my life, and I see him in my children. People have said to me, forget about the past, that, it's gone, that's it. But we can't forget about these brave men and women who stood up for us. John has nieces and nephews who will not forget. They will not be going away. And we are very heartened by the amount of young people who signed the letter in the paper during the week, and the next generation will not let this slide. They say that those bullets keep travelling, and it's very true. But also our strength and our resistance together will keep travelling. Guramila, my Agav, thank you so much for taking the time to listen today. Let's hold them to account. They cannot hide in the shadows any longer. And when Martin and Mark asked me to do this webinar, and they told me that I had to speak for 8 minutes, I was like, oh my God, how am I ever going to speak for 8 minutes? Actually, I felt that I had a lot to say, and I've got a lot more to say, but that'll do you for the day. Thank you so much. Guramila.
Thank you, Pauline. And the pamphlet that Pauline held up, Collusion in Kappa, that is available. If you go to the Relatives for Justice website, look at reports, you can actually hit that up. You can read it. We have a link. Andre Murphy just sent me a link for it, which we'll try and circulate. The most devastating part of that report, I believe, is at the end. They have all the hallmarks of collusion, but there's a whole list of people, Rosa and Mal and Liam, other families with the same ballistics, the same people were presumably involved in killing that Kip murder, so many other murders in the section of East Tehran. So I'd recommend that to everybody. All right, now to go to our next speaker. And I think after listening to Pauline, after listening to you, Jim, you'll see why we think it's so important just to understand what happened through individual stories. But I saw that one person who checked in that would be known to a lot of people on this webinar is Malachi McAllister, whose family was attacked just off the Ormar Road. And if you think that was in any way atypical, if you think that wasn't what happened to many people, if you think his story was different or exaggerated, I want you to listen to our next speaker, Jim Clinton, who also lived just off the Ormar Road. And he's going to tell his personal story of why he signed the letter asking for truth and justice. Jim, welcome.
Thank you, Martin. I'm delighted to be involved today and to put across a personal aspect of what happened to our family, but that's typical of the 3,500 people who signed it, and they'll all have their individual stories. Well, I'll start off and I'll follow on a bit from what Martin said. Most of you do know Malachi McAllister. Malachi lived 2 streets from me. I was there the night his house was attacked, and Malachi and my brother are married to 2 sisters. So we come from a very small area in South Belfast, which was surrounded by Unionists and Loyalists. Probably to give you a sort of an idea and a feel for what size it was roughly about a quarter of a mile by 400 or 500 yards, literally 10 or 12 streets, and there was over 40 people killed. One of the big attacks, obviously, and I'm sure people in America would remember it, was the Sean Graham boogies. We also had the Rose and Crown Bar, which happened in 1975 when there were 6 people killed there. And in every street, there was people killed. Every street. So my story is, I met Teresa as my childhood sweetheart. We lived next door to each other. Forgive me for being emotional. I've been talking about this for almost 27 years. It doesn't get any easier. It's difficult, but I hate to let people down. I hate to let relatives of justice down. They have been a rock for me, for my family, and for numerous other families. So I'll try and get through it without being as emotional as and angry as I can. We grew up together. We started going out. We were married very young. I was 18. Teresa was 19. We bought our first house before we were married, and we settled on the Armour Road. In 1994, Danny made a wee mistake, and I'll not hold it against him. He said 1991. In 1994, the 14th of April, I was working as a taxi driver in West Belfast. I'd been out at work. I'd come home from work. I took my youngest daughter with me, who was 3 years of age. I took her to work with me to give Teresa a break. Siobhan, as everybody knows, is my youngest, my baby, who's almost 30. Her sister, there's 10 years between them. She was 12 when her mother was killed. Siobhan was 3. When that day happened, we met up in town. Teresa took Siobhan home. I worked late that night, which was unusual. I was home for around 11 p.m. I came in, I spoke to Teresa. I had a headache. I said I was going to bed. She said she would follow me up the stairs. In the house, we had security, as in bars on our doors, grills at the bottom of our stairs, because we always thought that there would be an attack on the house. We had moved numerous times and securing each house as we went along. There wasn't bulletproof glass in the windows, but there was laminated glass. It wouldn't have stopped bullets, but we were hoping it would have stopped someone coming in the window. I went to bed. I was still awake. I heard thuds. I heard Teresa squealing. I heard shooting. I ran out onto the landing. I called Teresa. I ran back in again. I looked out the window. I seen the car driving off. And as I stood at that window, seconds later, not minutes, seconds later, a police car pulled up. They didn't follow the car down the street. They came to my door. I ran down the stairs. I knew by looking at Teresa, she was dead. I could see by the injuries, she was dead. I looked at the front window and the blind had been opened up and there was a concrete block sitting on the settee. The people who fired through the window seen a woman sitting in her nightdress and they hit her 23 times. It wasn't a spray of a living room. It wasn't what they said that they killed me and injured her. They knew what they were doing. They deliberately targeted her. And that was borne out in killings after that. And one of them has been mentioned today, Roseanne Mallon, Kathleen O'Hagan. They went in and if the husband or the son was not there, they killed the women of the house. Kathleen O'Hagan was 7 or 8 months pregnant when she was murdered. So I came downstairs. I threw the concrete block out the window because people were starting to gather outside and they were looking in. I went to the front door, I opened the door, and there's a policeman standing at my door. The same policeman who arrested me for having a bunch of keys, the same policeman who arrested me because I had the audacity to grow a beard, and the same policeman who harassed myself and Teresa when we were pushing our child around the district to go and visit grandparents. That's who was at my door. The same person who didn't drive after the people who killed my wife. I closed the door, refused to let them in. My friends came to the door, I opened the door, I let them in. They came in, and eventually the ambulance came. The ambulance man came in and he spoke to me, and he says, Jim, Teresa's dead. I said, I know Teresa's dead. He says, you have to let the police in. I said, I'm not letting them in. There was a standoff with the police, and I agreed to let the detectives in, not the uniformed police. So I left the house with my daughters. Roseanne had heard the shooting. Say she was 12, almost 13. Siobhan had just celebrated their birthday a month before. We have lovely photos of that in that house, with Siobhan celebrating her 3rd birthday. I took him to my sister-in-law's and my sister who lived on the other side of the street. When I tried to get back into Teresa, the same policeman would not let me in to be with Teresa's body. Eventually, I got back into the house. That's the start of it. What then happened after that compounds everything that happened that night. Witnesses seen the people who were driving the car. 3 of them were prepared to identify the person on identification parade. They went to the police station, but the police read out their names and address in front of the leader of the Unionist death squad that killed Teresa. 2 of them moved house within Belfast quickly. The other one went home to live in Derry because they were petrified of being targeted by this person and his gang. So that was the start of it. They colluded with him in the police station so he would be released. The HET report says there was 10 suspects in her murder. 2 were arrested. They all live within a mile of my house. 2 of them were arrested, the other 8 weren't arrested. That's how much they thought of Teresa and her killing. I've spoke to the police twice in 27 years, and I was a witness. Once was during the wake, and once was at an inquest. Then you go back further when Brian Nelson brought weapons into the country and was also targeting people. A British agent who put 2 people into a park facing my house and had them watching my house. Targeted by a British agent who worked for Britain, who imported guns, and that were used, and as Mark pointed out, on numerous killings after that shipment of weapons came in. I have met with the police ombudsman. I've asked questions there. I've asked for the ballistics of the weapons. Was there any history in them? 5 years later, they can't tell me. But if I was to use a weapon, and if I was arrested, they can get forensics and ballistics reports within days. The only thing I know is that the Sterling submachine gun that was used to kill Teresa is an old British Army weapon and an old RUC weapon. The Ruger handgun that was used is an RUC issue weapon. Surely they can tell me after 5 years if those weapons were used in any other killings and where they came from. But they choose not to. Sure, why would they? They don't care. We went to courts. We've tried everything. Our families are torn apart. My oldest daughter is now older than her mother when she was killed. I have now 4 grandchildren. They ask about their granny. They know what happened. That is something a 6, a 7, and a 9-year-old or a 12-year-old child should not know, should not need to know. But they go along, they want to be part of it, and we want them to know what happened. But we would also like them to have a normal life where they don't have to do this, and it would stop with us, and the British government would eventually tell the truth. And the RUC stroke PSNI would stop going to court and blocking families at every step. At every step. Not all our families are politicized. And I would say the majority of them aren't, but they're becoming politicized. But most of them want to get on with their lives. Most of them want their children and their grandchildren to have a normal life. All they're asking for is the truth. Why can they not tell the truth? Because they're hiding something. Why can they not tell me the truth about the weapons it was using Teresa's killing? Because they're hiding something. Why can they not admit that Brian Nelson was targeting my house? Because they're hiding something. In the gang that killed Teresa, it has already come out in court that one of them was a British agent. This is not something that we're making up. The evidence is there. If people like Ralphs for Justice can pick through stuff and get evidence and names and addresses and times and dates, why can the PSNI stroke RUC not do that? Because they don't want to. Because as far as they're concerned, who's Teresa Clinton? Who cares about Teresa Clinton? Well, we care. Her family care. And we will continue, even though it's hurtful, even though it's sad, even though it makes you angry. And I've told Mark Thompson this numerous times, when he comes to, they ask me to do stuff, Mark, it's so hard. This will annoy me for a week. It annoyed me for a week coming up to it, worrying about it, nervous about it. I told my kids what was happening. I've since remarried. I married Roseanne. Roseanne's husband was murdered by the same gang. Her 3 children are crying out for the truth. Her grandchildren are crying out for the truth. I'm sure there's others like us, but it's hard. It's hard. It's hard come Christmas. It's hard come anniversaries. It's hard come birthdays. When Roseanne's youngest son, Keane, and Siobhan, when we all lived together, and the kids have all grown up and moved out now, but when we were all at home, it was so difficult to take 2 young kids to a grave on Christmas morning and then take them to another grave on Christmas morning to pay their respects. I don't know whether we done the right thing doing that. I hope we did. We would like the kids to remember their father and their mother. But we found that extremely difficult. The older kids, they withdrew into themselves. Hopefully, at some stage, they'll be able to live a normal life, as normal as possible. This year should have been a very happy year for us. Siobhan's 30, young Roseanne's 40, I was 60, Teresa was 60. This all happened in 1 year. What a celebration that would have been. We would have been in New York. We would have been visiting family that we have in America. I asked people in America, as you have done for numerous years, help us get the truth. Put this out of our mind. Let us get on with a normal life. help us and help the 3,500 other people who are on that list and the many more who could have been on that list to have a normal life. Thank you very much.
I want to thank you, Jim, and I just want everybody to understand, you listen to Pauline, you listen to Jim, you can tell about the emotion, the hurt, the strong appeal that they are making to Irish America to help them. And as I said, these are typical stories. You could have had any of 3,500 people who signed that petition. In fact, there could have been more. Tell and much the same stories about how their family members were killed by British forces, or either directly or acting in collusion, how they've never been given the truth, how they fought for it, how they simply want the truth and justice, and that's why they're appealing for our help, as well as to the Irish and British governments, simply to follow an agreement that they had. All right. There is also on the Relatives for Justice website information about Jim's case. There was a plaque put down, there's a speech, other information. We will try and post that also. Our next speaker is now a Sinn Féin MLA from Belfast. He is the spokesperson on policing and justice. I know for many Hibernians, including myself, a much more prestigious title would be a former H-Block escapee. And it's remarkable. It's one of the things about the state, about British rule in the north of Ireland, that when you trust or elect people to represent you, you often choose people who felt that when they were growing up, their only alternative, their only way to get justice was to fight against and resist the state. And our next speaker is one of those, that is Jerry Kelly.
Thank you, Martin, and thanks very much to be invited this. It's an honour to be able to partake in this, and I'm very glad that the Ancient Order of Hibernians invited me, and obviously Mark. And as has been said a couple of times here, I want to thank you at the start for what you are doing today, what you have done for many, many years. And we'll get to this at the end. What I suppose we're looking is to continue to do into the future. Look, I mean, my job in a way is a touch easier. When I listened to Pauline and Jim, as I'm sure everybody felt it, I nearly felt like coming on and saying, look, we should just stop it there. Because it is the human side of all of this. It is, when Jim's talking about not only himself and his family, but also children and then grandchildren. And I think Mark mentioned this, that this is generational. And the biggest lesson is that it isn't just that one generation that's suffering because of what the Brits have done or failed to do. It has gone through generations, and that is a terrible tragedy. And in speaking to people of my generation, one of the things they worry about is that the burden was carried by those who suffered, but then it is going generationally. So we really need to keep the pressure on and put the pressure on to get this brought to some sort of, I don't know if conclusion is the right word, but certainly to get to as much of the truth and justice as we possibly can. My job in a way is to maybe go through a bit of the background very quickly and bring us up to date on what has happened. Some has been mentioned before. But I mean, if you go back, and as Pauline said, this goes back centuries. But in terms of this, if we go back to the Eames-Bradley report in 2009, what Sinn Féin's position was at the time was that an International Independent Truth Commission was the way to go forward. And there's examples of that throughout the world, many examples. When Eames-Bradley brought out the report, it actually floundered, not on a lot of the stuff they said, but on the fact that part of it was that there would be £12,000 as a reparation, as an acknowledgement to all those, and I mean all victims. And it was the Unionists and the British government who rejected it, using that as an excuse to reject it. Myself and Sean Murray and others, of course, but we were representing the party involved in the Haas O'Sullivan talks in 2013. And our position moved from addressing all options that families had wanted. And they don't always speak the same voice. There's people who want different things. Some want prosecution, some don't. And it's a very wide ranging community. And I'm talking the community right across the board here. But they want the justice and information recovery. And themes and patterns, as was pointed out with Pauline and Jim, you know, you found out there was one killing and then you found out through ballistics, and not coming from the cops or not coming from the British government or anywhere else, but found out through research that some of the people who were involved in one killing were involved in many killings. And what Sinn Féin did was sign up to that. It was a compromise, but it was a good compromise to try and get, but it was structures that we could move forward. And of course, political unionism rejected them. When then in 2014, we came to the Stormont House Agreement, which I was involved in as well. We did come to a compromise in terms of a number of structures, which were supported by the 5 main parties. It's important to say this because of what's happening today. But it was important, but it was supported by the 5 main political parties, but also by both governments, by the British and Irish governments. And it outlined key mechanisms to facilitate independent investigations, for instance, in the Historical Investigations Unit. Information recovery, which I suppose translated broadly is that Truth Commission in the ICIR. There was a storytelling process, which actually goes on in any case, but to make it more open and formal, oral history archive, which would allow everyone, whatever their view of any incident was, to be able to talk about that. And there was the Implementation and Reconciliation Group, which was there to deal with themes and patterns, to try and bring it forward, as well as reconciliation, improve services, especially about mental health, and also more discussion around facilitating a pension for those seriously injured in the conflict. And we're continued in that until a draft bill was put together in July of 2017. And in 2018, late in 2018, after a lot of pushing, the NIO put that out for consultation on the draft bill. And the outcome of that, and it was a huge number of people were involved in the consultation, answered, sent in submissions and that. And there was wide public support for the key elements of the Stormont House Agreement. And a strong opposition came across to any idea of amnesty. So at this stage, we had both political and public endorsement of the Stormont House Agreement. We go then until January of 2020, and we have the New Decade, New Approach, which was there in terms of bringing the institutions back up, which had fell 3 years before. And it's probably worth quoting the British government in this document because they gave a commitment to, and I quote, within 100 days to publish and introduce legislation in the UK Parliament to implement the Stormont House Agreement to address NI legacy issues. The government will now start an intensive process with the parties and the Irish government as appropriate to maintain a broad-based consensus of these issues, recognising that any such parliamentary legislation should have the consent of the Assembly. Now, since then, there has been no, and I mean none, and we have been at them time and time again, no meaningful engagement from the British government, and nor have they made any attempt to implement the Stormont House Agreement. On the contrary, what we then get was a written ministerial statement from the British Secretary of State, Brandon Lewis, on March the 18th, 2020. And the statement clearly outlines the policy intent of the British government in legacy. And it clearly seeks to avoid any legal investigation of the British government role in the conflict, or indeed what its forces and agents were involved in, including, as was discussed earlier, as mentioned earlier, the whole issue of collusion, which was huge when you look at that. So it's focused on closing down avenues, not opening them up, but on closing down avenues pursued by families for disclosure information and accountability in relation to the death of their loved ones. This unilateral statement, it represents a clear and also a very cynical departure from both the policy intent and the mechanisms outlined by the Stormed House Agreement. So after years of actually getting an agreement, we now have the British government moving away from it in a very blunt and obvious way. So following the statement, of course, because that has a knock-on effect, what we get is the Public Prosecution Service's decision not to pursue state agents in what was called the steak knife investigation, which involved a state agent. And then just before Christmas, Brandon Lewis refused to order an inquiry into the murder of Pat Finucane. I mean, I was involved also in the Western Park talks, so this is how far back this goes. It was a commitment by both governments in the Western Park talks in 2001 that there would be an independent public inquiry. And since then, they actually quite quickly after that introduced a new Inquiry Act to make that inquiry much less. And the Finucane family very bravely and very strongly opposed that, and have been fighting for the inquiry, the public inquiry since then. And Brandon Lewis then has knocked that back as well. So I suppose there are clear examples of the bad faith and duplicity. Jim talked about other examples of it, and there are many, many examples. And the fact that, you know, people, even who were not involved, I remember saying, so there was a report out on the McGurk's bar bombing. And I remember saying to the chief constable of the PSNI at the time, who criticised what the ombudsman was saying about it, asking what age he was at the time, because he was defending the RUC, and he was taken by surprise. He was only a kid. And he says, "What are you defending? Stuff that you know nothing about, when people have done investigations and have a different view of it and have actually looked at the evidence." So that's one of the difficulties, that a new generation of state forces and different branches of state forces take on and behave as if they're defending themselves, when in fact they're defending issues that were happening way before that. And the people have obviously been campaigning for this. And the example, I suppose one of the examples, there are many, many examples, is, you know, the Ballymurphy families have been campaigning for 50 years. So we have, our job and our intent and our wish was always to give support to the families in their various campaigns over the years, and to try and keep them up to date in the various campaign groups about what is happening in these various negotiations. And obviously, every time you think you've got that part forward, then something else comes. And I think it's not just that they don't care about the victims. They know precisely what they're doing. And what they're afraid of is they're afraid of the truth. They don't want they already know what the truth is. They simply do not want that to be out public. They do not want that for other people to know what this government and successive governments have been doing, not just during the conflict, but since the conflict, in terms of all of that. So, I mean, and I'm repeating, it's very hard to speak after listening to Pauline and Jim, and as they pointed out, there are so many, many other people. I mean, there are 3,500 who have signed that letter. But let me say, as about Irish American, and I know Bruce is there as well, and he was involved way back, is to understand, and I think you know this from your own work, that Irish America, through their lobbying, through their contacts, through individuals within Congress, have been able to make changes during the peace process, going way back, when they strategically entered into and at times fought with the British government and pushed the British government, then they can have that impact. And I suppose that's what we're looking to continue now. And I mean, not a small example, but some examples even more recently in the part of the USA is in Brexit. It was Irish American groups and supporters in Congress who pushed the British government to sign the withdrawal agreement and the Irish protocols, which would not have happened without their roles. There have been times when their influence, sometimes it's hard to describe or to quantify that influence, except to say that at crucial times, right back to Bill Clinton, at crucial times in the peace process and post-peace process where we are now, that movement by the Ancient Order Hibernians and by a number of other Irish American groups have pushed the British government to move. So what we're looking for, as always, and you know, I repeat that the thing that I suppose in a certain way affects me most maybe is this intergenerational effect that it's been having on people, right down to very young people now, is to use that influence, is to keep campaigning, is to keep supporting relatives for justice and the families, and to be in the middle of all the setbacks. And if you listen to the Jim and Paul and how long they've been at this, that against all the setbacks, we can still endeavor and we can still succeed and we can still get what families have been fighting for so many generations. And I just finished my last wee thing, which you know, we talk about CAPS, we talk about the chief constables and that. But I do remember being in one of the sessions around the Stormont House Agreement, actually, when I think the chief constable at the time was a guy called George Hamilton, and he was the chief constable. And he came into the room and he was asked by unionists about inquests and about the legacy structures. And his comment was very straightforward. He says, we don't want to deal with it. You need to deal with it. And while it's not been dealt with, of course, it is sitting again. And we've always argued that it has to be done on the basis of a human rights compliant manner. And while it's not doing, the present PSNI continue with it. They continue. This is supposed to be their job, and of course they aren't human rights compliant. So if that chief constable and the present chief constable is saying that it should be taken away from them and dealt with in an independent structures, then even then, this British government is not listening. But like many other campaigns we've involved in, we will, in my opinion, win this campaign and get truth and justice to the families. And that's what we're determined doing, along with the relatives and along with the organizations in America and throughout the Irish diaspora, who have always been there to assist and to intervene when they could. So I thank you for that.
Okay, just want to thank Jerry. I just note, I'm doing research for this. I have a letter was signed by 16 members of Congress in April 16th of 2018. Richie Neal and Chris Smith were on it. They got a letter back on May 1st from the British government, how they would never have amnesties. They were looking to implement the Stormont House Agreement, all of the things that they've never done and not doing. And we've got to work on that. More congressional action, as Jerry was saying. We want to work on that, as well as other things, a Christmas appeal to try and keep these Irish American groups, the groups working for freedom, doing that and pushing that forward. All right, I now just, before throwing it back to Danny O'Connell, I just want to thank him. He's done a tremendous job in organizing this and putting this program on, and so many. He's got a number of very influential guests and speakers that we want to recognize. So I'll throw it back to our national president, who's really led this initiative and so many others, Danny O'Connell.
Thank you, Martin, for your work today. And of course, all the work you've done, and Mark Thompson, who's worked with us hand in hand with, I think, every video we've done on Freedom for Ireland. Thank you both. Great work. Next up, I would like to welcome a great friend of Ireland and a great friend of the Ancient Order Hibernians, former United States Congressman Bruce Morrison. Bruce, welcome. Please unmute and you can begin.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you, Martin. I'm not here to do a lot of talking. I was here to listen. There's very little that I could say that would be important in the face of what we heard from Jim and Pauline. Those messages are the real thing, and the real message that has to be heard by people who want to do right by this issue. I'm a co-chair of the ad hoc committee to protect the Good Friday Agreement. We came into existence in the face of Brexit, and our focus for the last 2 years has been primarily on the issue of Brexit and on the openness of the whole island of Ireland and no hard border, and the defense of the withdrawal agreement and the Irish Protocol to make sure that that would actually be true. But there's more to our remit, and that is protecting the Good Friday Agreement and the Stormont House Agreement and the investigation and resolution of legacy issues is part of the Good Friday Agreement. And our committee is going to invest its energy this year in issues of rights and reconciliation. So we're focused on this. This is a very timely event. I heard what I heard. It's not new, but it is unfortunately still ongoing. And we recognize that. We will be paying attention to that, and we will be welcoming people to participate. Danny and Martin already participate as members of the committee. They will be there in pursuing this process. I thank you for inviting me to be here today. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to drop off after this statement, but I hope you will know that our committee, and Jim Walsh is my co-chair, and you all know Jim Walsh and his long commitments on these issues, and Kevin Sullivan has worked as our executive director. So we're committed to seeing that the Stormont House Agreement and all the things on legacy that flow from the Good Friday Agreement are not allowed to be forgotten, because they are part of that agreement. That agreement wasn't just setting up a Stormont Assembly and moving on. That agreement had many parts, and human rights and the respect for what had happened in the conflict and resolving it to the satisfaction of those who suffered. That was very much part of the Good Friday Agreement, and we're not going to forget that. And I thank you to Jim and Pauline in particular for underlining that in personal terms, painful as it is for them. It's very important for us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce. As expected, great words of wisdom, and we appreciate your support throughout the year and the work you do. And one of the things Bruce always offers us is a view from both sides. He's an individual that looks at the needs of the unionists and also the needs of the nationalists. He looks at the entire community and each group on each portion of each group divided into North Ireland, and has been able to shine on so much light to us and other people around the state. And we certainly appreciate that. On lockdown in Galway is another friend of the AOH. And I think when Dan Dennehy introduced him, most people thought he was the senator for the Ancient Order Hibernians, but he was a senator for the diaspora, the first ever senator appointed specifically for the diaspora. And he did such great work with not only the Ancient Order Hibernians, but Irish Americans all over the country and beyond, not just America, but the diaspora in all countries. And Billy, I just wanted to invite you to say hello and any comments you might have or questions. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Danny, and thank you to all the participants. Very moving, of course, and I think it's so important that you gave us this forum today. All of us need to hear the stories, and I think it's the personal stories that we've heard that are the most striking and stay in the mind. And I think it's very important. I know that the AOH, and I've worked very closely with you over the last number of years in the States, has always been to the fore with the Irish issue and with the whole issue and the British government or whatever, and the Irish government, of course. But I also think that we have a much broader Irish community that in the States that we need to get to, and with the Irish immigrant support groups, I think it'd be very important that we get the stories out to them, that our members in the States and in Britain actually, and throughout where the Irish diaspora is, that they get to hear these stories. I think it's very important, because there's no doubt about it what with the AOH and the ad hoc committee in the States and the influence they exert on Congress is unreal. We play way above our weight, by the way, in the American Congress, and especially with the likes of the AOH and the ad hoc committee, with the likes of Richie Neal, who's chairman of the Ways and Means. Now we have President Biden in situ, and also we have Senator Dick Durbin, my own friend from Illinois, who's going to be chairman of the Judiciary. We have many avenues open to us for influence with the British government, and I'd be delighted, and will be, and I'll be talking to you, Danny, about it. But I will use any influence that I have when I get back, get out of here and get back, hopefully in the near future. But again, I'm delighted. I'm really delighted to have heard the stories today, because we don't hear enough of it, you know, and you can understand the pain of these families for their loved ones and whatever. But we will do what we can, Danny. I'm delighted that you invited me on this today, and thank you to everybody involved.
Thank you, Senator Lawless. We certainly appreciate all you do for the diaspora in Ireland in general. We welcome you at any time, and the thing I know, and I think most people understand, that even during lockdown, Senator Lawless has a telephone, and he's willing to pick it up, and he's willing to make contacts, and he's willing to help us out. We spoke last night on several issues, and he's got his thumb on the pulse of Irish America, and we certainly appreciate that. As we move on to our next guest, I want to remind everybody that we posted a link for our Freedom for Ireland Christmas appeal. One of the things we really like to do when we have these things is remind everybody, these are why, as we listen to Pauline and Jim speak, these are why we still continue our Freedom for Ireland Christmas appeal, and we raise money. And like everybody, it's trying times with the pandemic. So any extra help you can give personally, hit those links. All the forms are there. It's greatly appreciated. Next, we're going to hear from our president of the Ladies Ancient Order Hibernians in America from Albany, New York, Karen Keane.
Thank you, Danny. And I also want to say thank you for allowing us, the LAOH, to be a part of this today. When I was hearing the stories, it brings everything back to the personal level. Governments make decisions, and they enter into treaties, and they enter into agreements, and then the next group comes in and they want to discard it. But they forget the impact of the individual people that it has. We have to remember government has its power because we, the people, allow it to have that power. And what we have to remind people is that these agreements were entered into at the encouragement of people for the healing of people. And we have to remind people through our, like on the LAOH side, through our Political Education Committee and our Freedom for Ireland Committee, that there are peoples whose lives are still impacted, generational now we see, and they need to have their justice. They need to have an acknowledgement that their government or the body of people who are governing their land did something wrong, and they need to acknowledge that. We all know that somebody has to admit something before healing can happen. And we as women know how important that is. So we have to help fight and educate people that these legacy issues are not resolved. There isn't everything in the Good Friday Agreement did not happen. And the best person we have on our side to do that is our Freedom for All Ireland Chair, woman, Dolores Dash, who's so well versed on all of this and is working with the political education committee to get these things highlighted. So once again, Danny, my brother Hibernian, I thank you so much for allowing me to speak and for allowing the LAOH to be spotlighted in this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen, and for all the work you do and the ladies do. We are a team, and that's what leads to our success. Also joining us from the National Board of the Ladies Ancient Order Hibernians is their Freedom for Ireland Chair, Dolores Dash. Dolores?
Thank you, Danny. It's a privilege to be here with all of you today. This week, we were really pleased to see the letter go out to Taoiseach and to the Prime Minister. The work that's being done by Relatives for Justice is incredible. We were able to see the videos that were made this week by family members, which really brings the face to these issues. And these stories all need to be heard, as we know. They're unique. These folks are unique that were killed. They were sons, they were mothers, they were daughters. And that uniqueness needs to be brought forward. The impact on each member needs to be brought forward. And in stark contrast, we see the similarities in all of these cases: the collusion, the murders, the cover-up, the loss of evidence. All of these are really important points that Relatives for Justice does such a great job in uncovering, in documenting. And that's why the Ladies Ancient Order of Hibernians is a strong supporter for Freedom for All Ireland. We raise funds for Relatives for Justice and other justice groups because we believe in the work that's being done, and we want to support that work. To the family members that are on the call today, and particularly to Pauline and Jim, thank you so much for coming and telling us this. This really helps to get that message out to everyone, and these stories need to be told. The strength, your courage, it's so inspiring to us, and it helps us continue to do the work to help raise that awareness, raise that funding that we can help with through the Christmas appeal that Danny talked about. So I just want to say thank you for all the work that was done today to put this together, and the ladies are behind this effort 100%. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dolores, you do great work. You and Martin make quite a team, and we certainly appreciate all you do. And under the line of our next guest needs no introduction, I'd like to welcome our National Vice President, Sean Pender. Sean.
Thank you, Mr. President. And again, I echo the sentiments of all. Fantastic program put together. And Martin and Dolores, you do great work together. You know, it was over about 20 years ago when I first walked into the Falls Road office of Relatives for Justice and met Mark Thompson and Clara and Andre. And I think it was one of the greatest things that ever happened to me in my life. It gave me a passion. It told me this story. I've been to Kappa. I've known Jim Clinton. I'd like to call him a friend. And the powerful emotion that Pauline and Jim spoke of makes us want to do more. We did in 2007 bring a small group of people from both traditions to DC to speak about the loss of life in collusion, and we need to do more. But I think Jerry Kelly hit the head, right on the head. The British know what they've done. They just don't want it to come out. This is nothing more than the biggest cover-up in the British government, and they simply do not care. Before lockdown, I was in DC in Bruce Morrison's meeting with former Congressman Jim Walsh and former Congressman Joe Kelly, and I put to the Secretary of State of the North the question about those 100 days. And of course, he pontificated and punted, because that's what they've all done. Jerry and Mark have listed all the things going back to Good Friday, Weston Park, Ames Bradley. All of these things had good portions of them. None were perfect, but the British government has failed to implement anything. So I'm very, very, buoyed by this today, and hope that we can use 2021 as a time to continue to tell this story. And it feels real good that being on that committee now with Morrison, former Representative Morrison and Walsh and Crowley and others, that we could use this, because you saw what Irish America did to get what we needed in Brexit. If we can put that same political pressure behind getting legacy, please God, 2021 is the year we can make some progress. And that's why it's great to see all the people that are on this call, but that's why this is so important from a Freedom for All Ireland Christmas appeal. Relatives for Justice has been one of our stalwarts that we give donations to every year, and a lot of this reporting is enabled because of the funds that we give. So we know 2020 and 2021 has been tough with money and donation, but whatever you can do this year from a division, county board, state board, and individual will be greatly appreciated. And I look forward to continued work with all the disciples of truth we have out there to get justice for the likes of Pauline and Jim and unfortunately way too many others. So thank you, brothers and sisters, and God bless.
Thank you, Sean. Great work as always. Peter Kissel, we might be getting some feedback from your end. Just as you unmuted, he's going to speak to us in just a moment. I'd like to recognize some of our friends who are joining us on the YouTube link. A Hibernian legend, Kathleen Savage, who works harder or as hard as anyone I know on the issues in the North Ireland. Thank you for being here today, Kathleen. Karen Quinn, who is representative to the United States from Sinn Féin, and he does a great job working with the Ancient Order Hibernians throughout the year. Karen, I think you're also on our Zoom feed, so if you have any comments, if you'd raise your hand, that would bring you up to the top of the line. And I also noticed John Wilson, a member of our National Oversight Committee from Missouri. As I said, we have people, I know now we're over 31 states. We're getting great representation, and to hear Pauline and Jim today, and of course, Jerry Kelly, what a great day. But for just some brief comments, I'd like to welcome Peter Kissel from the Irish American Unity Conference. Peter.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay now, Danny?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I adjusted my mic. First of all, of course, I do want to thank Danny as well as Martin for arranging this great webinar. So educational, so informative, and we appreciate, on behalf of the Unity Conference, we certainly appreciate your opening this up to our members and lots of others, because it's so important to hear these stories. And in particular, I want to thank also Pauline and Jim for sharing their stories. I know that is a very difficult thing to do, but as Karen mentioned, and others have mentioned, Dolores and all, it's so important for us to hear these personal stories. I mean, you know, we Irish America work to bring your stories to Congress and to all of America, and we get remotivated, if you will, re-inspired when we hear your real pain, when we hear your personal impact. And it is so important for us to hear that, because it helps us convey it to people that we're talking to. So thank you so much, as difficult as it is to do that. I want to just mention maybe emphasize the letter that Mark referred to, and all of you have referred to, the letter of by the 3,500 victims' families to the Taoiseach and to the Prime Minister. I want to mention to everybody on the call that letter does appear on the Relatives for Justice website. It's easily downloadable, and I will be having our Unity Conference members be conveying that letter to our friends in Congress, and I want to urge everybody to do likewise. It is a very powerful, short, but very powerful letter. So please, everybody, get that letter to your congressional representatives. And regarding the letter, Mark, I do have a question for you. I notice, not insignificantly, that it is framed from the outset in terms of the human rights of the victims, which is exactly what we're talking about here. And just 10 days ago, on the 13th of January, the British government began another one of their nefarious actions, calling for evidence on their review of the Human Rights Act. And I wanted to see what your reaction to that is, Mark, and whether you think it's a worthwhile exercise for any of us to be commenting on, whether it is a complete foregone conclusion that they're going to revise the Human Rights Act. Could you hear me, Mark?
Just trying to unmute. Can you hear me?
Yep.
You're good.
Yeah. Thanks for the comments. Just to revisit a few things in terms of what you're saying, Peter, this is about rights. Families, you see, as citizens and under the Good Friday Agreement, expected their rights to be upheld. That's the rights to truth, the right to proper investigations. And the letter also is timed. The United Nations, very ironically, the United Nations were in touch with a number of us asking us, could we give them an update progress report on the implementation of the legacy mechanisms agreed at Stormont House and how they were working? And we went back to Geneva and we said they're not even implemented. So that followed a UN fact-finding visit in 2015 and a report about the Stormont House Agreement and about the fact that it was, even the UN had recognised it was a major compromise, but it was still a human rights pathway forward, and still the British haven't implemented it. What the British are trying to do here, and Sean Pender, I suppose, crystallised it exactly, it's continue the cover-up. They want a soft landing. What happened was when Jerry Kelly talked about, rightly, after the Stormont House, they went to a consultation process. I argued the British government didn't need to do that. They had the consent of 2 governments and 5 parties, and the parties were listening to people in their constituencies and the victims and what their needs were. But they went to a consultation. They had over 17,000 responses to the consultation. That's huge. That's beyond anything ever. And the 17,000 responses called for the full implementation of Stormont House. And the beauty even of how Sinn Féin have approached this, they have kind of stood back and said, listen, this is for everybody. This is even for people that have been harmed by the IRA, who have been harmed by Republicans. We are consenting to engage in good faith in a process that looks at all of these issues. So it wasn't just the sense that this was a focus on one or the other. But the problem is, and I go back to what I say, the measure of accountability, by and large, for Republicans has been 25,000 plus of them spent 120,000 years in jail, versus the British state. And the British state killed 367 people whilst they were in uniform on duty. And through collusion, they killed probably twice as many. So you're looking at about a third of the killings in the conflict attributable directly to the British government. And they don't want that truth. And they're looking at soft landing, and now they're talking about a different way forward, about truth telling, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, reconciliation, and let's look at a different way. The nub of this and the crux and the core of this is a human rights compliant investigative way forward. Now, the UN are saying that. You mentioned the European Convention and the fact that they're going to look at it in the context of Brexit. They're leaving Europe around Brexit. They've left. The convention sits as a completely separate entity. The Convention on Human Rights, to which the British government don't want to implement in terms of all of these issues, because it provides an independent process that will examine and get to the truth. What they're actually doing is they're trying to rewrite the kind of a convention for themselves that's Brexit in style. But that European Convention on Human Rights was written by Conservative Party lawyers after the Second World War to ensure that no such horrible, unspeakable truths and violations would ever happen again. And if they did, this convention that they all subscribed to and signed up to would be a model in which it would hold governments to account. And what Relatives for Justice and the Committee on the Administration of Justice, the Finucane family, and many other families, they took landmark cases to Europe in 2000, May 2000, and significant rulings in 2001, indicted the British government and said, you are guilty of not only taking these lives, but the mechanism by way of remedying and accounting for what happened and holding to account those responsible. You have to do that. And since May 2001, when that judgment was delivered, the British government still haven't implemented a process. And they're going to Geneva to the UN, and they're going to Strasbourg to the European Court, and they're saying, well, we have the Stormont House Agreement, we're going to implement it. And they're looking at it in Europe and says, well, that could meet your legal obligations if you do that. Then they're coming back here and they're doing the complete opposite. And what they're looking is a soft way out, and we shouldn't allow them to get a soft way out. And caught in all of this is the whole architecture of the criminal justice system. So now we have the international spotlight, and we have a Lord Chief Justice in charge of the judiciary saying, we need to do this. Jerry Kelly's pointed out the PSNI don't want to know this. There are a cabal of former officers and people within it to try and control it and subvert it. But by and large, it should be taken away from them. And then we should have this agreement implemented. And that's what's required, nothing short of that. The Stormont House is the compromise. That is the compromise. There's no more compromising. It needs implemented. So thanks, Peter. But yes, people should, the Congress needs to get engaged in this the same way they did around Brexit. And we need US support and US muscle, political muscle and weight to push the British over that line. And the way we did with the peace process and appointing a chair, an independent chair of the talks, and Senator George Mitchell. So, you know, we're really appealing and asking for that support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Great words. Thank you for joining us today, Peter. Folks, we're going to move to our closing comments. We're going to hear from just a closing comment from each of our panelists. So our speakers today will go from Jerry to Jim to Pauline, and then Martin will close. But before we do that, we want to invite Karen Quinn, a good friend of the Ancient Order Hibernians, to say just a few comments, and we'll move into our closing comments. Karen?
And the LAOH for all our support over the past year as we try to progress. And I think, as Bruce said, it's about implementing all of the outstanding aspects of the Good Friday Agreement and the Legacy Agreement. For me, Danny, there's a couple of very key points in this, and Jerry and Sean both raised them. And this isn't about an investigation. The Brits and the British government know what they were involved in. This is about continuing a cover-up and withholding the truth. So for me, there's 2 points to it and what Irish America can do. The first point is to hold the British government to account, to hold the British government to account for its actions in refusing to implement the agreements, to keep on raising the issue, whether it is on legacy, whether it's the other outstanding aspects of the agreement, such as the unity referendum. So to hold the British government to account. And also then what we need to do is then strategize about how we then get them to implement those agreements. Because what has been proven, and Jerry raised it, and that we all know about the legacy of Irish America, is that when Washington talks, London listens. And no more so now, believe it or not, with Brexit. The British are now dependent more on US support than they had been previously when they were part of the EU for economic reasons. So I think that there's a change. We have to realize it's a change in dynamic between Britain and Ireland. There's a change in dynamic between the States and Britain, and how do we use that to our advantage to make sure that all of those outstanding issues on legacy, on unity referendum, are all implemented and we get the end of that. So I think there's hope here as well. We can move them, but the first thing is keep the issue live, keep holding the British government to account, and let's work out then what our next moves are going to be to actually get them to implement the agreements.
Thank you. Great words. What a great group of guests we had today. We will move to closing comments from Jerry Kelly.
Okay, thank you, and again, thank you. I think it was a very worthwhile discussion today, and I hope it goes out widely, and we'll certainly help to put it out widely. I mean, I think it's all been said and best articulated by Jim and Pauline. But I suppose the last thing I would say is, you know, what is the core influence? What is we need to do? We don't need to reinvent anything here. We have the Stormont House Agreement. It had the agreement of the 5 main parties. It had the agreement of the British government and of the Irish government. And what we need to push the British government to do, because they're the ones who are stepping away from it. And I have to say, although the unionist parties signed up to it, they're stepping away as well. They just haven't said it, but they're stepping away alongside them. Is that we have to say, here is an agreement that needs to be implemented. This is a compromise. There is no perfect way to deal with the past. There is none. But this is as close as we ever been able to get to it. And it is an agreement signed by all. And what people need to do is stand up to that. And in particular, the British government need to stand up to that, because they're the ones who are trying to go off in an entirely different direction to protect themselves. That's all it's about, is to protect themselves. And so that's in the end, all that I have to say is what do we want our American friends to do? What do we want our friends in Congress to do? Is to use that influence to tell the British government, you need to implement what you agreed. And it's as, and certainly it's as straightforward as that, even though we know it's a high hill to climb. But thank you very much for the invitation and the assistance that have been given, and this is going to give in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. We certainly appreciate your time. Next up, we're going to hear from Jim Clinton. Jim.
Green, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Danny, thanks very much for inviting me from the AOH, the LAOH, our Allies for Justice, groups that we can't do without. The victims need us. We need you to keep fighting for us. Usually the voice of us in America. I just hope that at some stage that people will listen, and it's time for truth. Thanks for letting me take part.
Thank you, Jim. We appreciate your time today, and incredible words, very moving words. We appreciate it so much. Pauline Quinn.
All I'd just like to say is thank you so much to everybody for their contribution today. And it was lovely to hear that support from you all. And as Jim said, you are our voice in Irish America. So thank you so much for your support. And just to leave you with this last comment, that the British government have no right in Ireland. They never had any right in Ireland, and they never can have any right in Ireland. So let them tell the truth, and then let them go. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful words earlier and great words to end it. Now, if we'll hear closing comments from Mark Thompson.
Danny, I've spoken off. I'm happy for other people to speak.
I thought so too. You great words, Mark, as always. We couldn't do what we do without Mark. And for closing comments from our Freedom for Ireland Chairman, Martin Galvin.
Well, Mark wouldn't say anything, but I just want to say how important this initiative is, how much important the work of Relatives for Justice is. We're honored that he gave Irish America an opportunity to just be part of it. That's what this webinar is a part of it. And I'm just very proud of the work that some of these groups, including the AOH, the Unity Conference, the Brehons, Irish Northern Aid, others who are there watching and with us. America has always found a way to support those who are working for justice and freedom in Ireland. Right now, we've got COVID. It's very difficult. We're finding a way through this webinar that Danny has organized, through the other things that we're doing. We want to find a way to work with the new Congress, with the new administration, letters like the one that I just talked about from May 1st of 2018, back to the British government, where they made them promises and reneged on everything just the same way that they do with the families. When it comes to supporting the groups who works for Freedom for All Ireland, just grants like Relatives for Justice, working to contribute despite the difficult circumstances today. And we're gonna, all of us, find a way to work with Relatives for Justice, to work with every family who demanded justice or requested justice on that letter, to work with the parties in Ireland, which are part of that agreement. We're just asking them, just go back to the British and say, you signed this agreement with us, let's implement it. Let's not renege here like you do on every other treaty, it seems, that the British renege on an island. So with that, I want to thank everybody. Today is a start. It's not a finish. These families, what they said to us today is too important to forget about or let them down. We're going to go ahead. They can count on us. We're never going to let them down.
Thank you, Martin. A great way to end it. I can't think of better words. I do want to recognize the folks that made this thing possible. Tim Noonan, one of our division presidents, a member of our National Freedom for Ireland committee from Chicago. Tim does a great job. I forced him to come online. They usually stay behind the scenes. And of course, our national digital coordinator, Chris Cook, the president from North Carolina. Great job, Chris. We couldn't have done it without you. To all our friends in Ireland, thank you for your time today. We had well over 250 people live on a Saturday morning in the United States between Zoom and YouTube here to listen. This will be live. I'll send it out to everybody, a direct link that starts it right at the beginning. And we look forward to everyone on this call sharing this link with everyone you can, so more people can hear the great words we heard today from Jerry, Jim, and Pauline. Thank you all so much. God bless.